Okay. So this is the original, what the original Christmas Carol looked like. Whoops, there we go. A Ghost Story of Christmas. I want to welcome you and thank you for being here today. And we already did share with some of you, asked about if you have read this story. And if you haven't, I'm sure that after you hear this presentation, and it's really a small tome. So I think you might be able to squeeze it in before the holidays. To best appreciate A Christmas Carol, let us discuss the man behind this great classic. Charles John Huffam Dickens was born on February 7th, 1812, in Portsmouth, England. He was the second born of 8 children to John Dickens and Elizabeth Barrow Dickens, joining elder sister Fanny. John Dickens worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office. Now, during his childhood, the Dickens family moved to London and then Chatham, where he spent several happy years discovering nature, books, and wonders of the imagination. As a child, Dickens was unaware of his parents' growing financial difficulties, which became apparent when he was only 5 months old, and they were forced to move and find more affordable quarters, a foreshadowing of bleak times to come. In 1823, financial constraints continued to thwart the stability of Dickens' family. Charles was removed from school due to expense, although Fanny was able to continue on scholarship. He instead ran errands for his father, many of which were to the pawn shop, in an effort to redeem money in exchange for the family's dwindling possessions. Thus began the darkest period of his life, one from which he would never fully recover and would revisit again and again within his works. On February 2nd, 1824, John Dickens was arrested for debt. The final collapse of the Dickens family resulted in the whole family being sent to debtor's prison at Marshalsea, with one exception. It was offered that the eldest son, 12-year-old Charles, could work at a blacking warehouse and earn 6 shillings a week, to which his parents wholeheartedly agreed. Now, this is the blacking warehouse where Dickens toiled for up to 10 hours a day, gluing labels on boot polish. And at the end of each day, he walked 4 solitary miles back to lodgings in Camden. And if any of you have read David Copperfield, that's an autobiographical part of his life that he put in there. So may want to revisit that as well. Fred Bernard in 1892 from John Foster's Life of Charles Dickens said, "The blacking warehouse was the last house on the left-hand side of the way at Old Hungerford Stairs. It was a crazy, tumble-down old house, abutting, of course, on the river and literally overrun with rats. Its wainscoted rooms and its rotten floors and staircase and the old gray rats swarming down the cellar, and the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times, and the dirt and decay of the place. This was the environment that the 12-year-old was subjected to for months." Now, this is a Marshalsea prison grill in Charles Dickens' London home, now a museum. The haunting experience that he kept as a secret hung over his own children's nursery. In his book, Charles Dickens and His World, Jason Priestley denotes that Somerset Maugham and others believe that Dickens and his admirers have made too much out of this blacking warehouse episode. The place may have been dark, dirty, rat-infested, but young Charles was not ill-treated or overworked, and it was common enough for boys of 12 to go out to work, and he did not remain there very long. But Priestley disagrees. These critics may not have found themselves shut out of school or working in blacking warehouses, forgetting what it is like to be a child in utter despair. And Dickens could not forget the frightening experience. In the Life of Charles Dickens, John Foster quotes his lasting impressions. "No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship. compared these everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, and felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast. The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was to my young heart. To believe that day by day, what I had learned and thought and delighted in and raised my fancy and my emulation up by was passing away from me, never to be brought back any more, cannot be written. My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and wander desolately back to that time of my life. So this is Marshalsea Prison today, and it's a site that you can actually go to visit. And I just want to put this, I want to show you one of the quotes from the book, Are There No Prisons? Are There No Workhouses? In the Victorian web, they actually show you what these workhouses look like. So this was the refuge for the destitute, the ward for females from the London News in 1843. The women's ward appears better lit than the men's, but both have the look of converted warehouses. And note the straw for bedding. And look at these, they're almost like coffins, what they had to sleep in. I saw another one with the Salvation Army where there are actually dead bodies in there. So the men's, they also show here an example of. So here's the men's male ward, refuge for the destitute. The feelings that Dickens expresses here should be kept in mind and can be used as a lens in viewing his works. The personal experiences of Dickens are not merely woven into many of his novels, but as an impressionable child working and living alone in a poor section of London, his family in prison, he was exposed to and able to make observations about societal ills not commonly apparent. As an author, he would use this understanding as the moral underpinning of many of his stories. It gave him a great sense of empathy. One of the most successful of these was A Christmas Carol, a ghost story. Now here's an oil painting of Charles Dickens by American artist Francis Alexander from when Dickens toured America in 1842, a year before he wrote A Christmas Carol. At this point, Dickens had been married to Catherine Hogarth for 6 years, and they already had 4 of the 10 children they would have together. Next, I wanted to show you a timeline of his published works, so you could see where A Christmas Carol falls in the pecking order here. So he had already written some of his notable works here, sketches by Boz, Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, Master Humphrey's Clock, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, American Notes, which he wrote while he was here and received some criticism for, and then A Christmas Carol, and then still to follow were, some also amazing works. So in the preface to A Christmas Carol, Dickens wrote, I've endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D., December 1843. Dickens had been inspired to write A Christmas Carol after witnessing the plight, especially of the poor children, in visits he made to the ragged schools in 1843, and felt the most powerful way to get this message across was with his pen. Although Dickens was not particularly religious, he wanted the novella to have the effect of a spiritual tract that would affect the reader to become more engaged with the less fortunate. He began writing in October, finishing on December 2nd. Written in 6 weeks during a period of intense creativity, it was published on December 19, 1843 by Chapman and Hall, London. Illustrations by John Leach. Unlike his previous novels, this was not published in serial form, but in a beautifully bound book. He wanted to produce a handsome volume with colored plates, colored title page, and all edges gilt. The expense of hand-colored plates cut considerably into his profits. As a result, this was his first and last book to include colored plates. The success of A Christmas Carol put Dickens on a much firmer financial standing. By Christmas Eve, every one of the 6,000 copies of the first print run were sold out. Dickens exclaimed, "It was a most prodigious success, the greatest I think I have ever achieved." Now here we're going to meet Scrooge and Marley's ghost. Scrooge's priorities, business over mankind, saw Christmas as a humbug. Marley's ghost says, "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmases ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Now, Declan Kiley, the curator at the Morgan Museum and Library, and others have posited that Scrooge is somewhat modeled on Dickens himself, who was undergoing tremendous financial hardship at the time of A Christmas Carol's publication. His father's continuous pecuniary difficulties continued to plague him. In a letter to his friend Mitten, whom John Dickens had borrowed money from unknown to Charles, shows the extent to which Dickens suffered from the continuous financial and emotional strain of his father's clandestine borrowing. So I guess the debtor's prison didn't affect him too much. And he, quote, says, "Nothing makes me so wretched or so unfit for what I have to do as these things. They are so entirely beyond my own control, so far out of my reach, such a drag chain on my life, that for the time they utterly dispirit me and weigh me down." And looking at a happier time in Scrooge's past, childhood and love, in late November, we have Fezziwigs Ball. In late November, Dickens wrote to his lawyer, Thomas Mitten, explaining this passage and his complete immersion in the book. "Your note found me in the full passion of a roaring Christmas scene. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake and negus, and a great piece of cold roast, and a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. And there was also Mrs. Fezziwig being twirled around and danced by Mr. Fezziwig, whose stocking calves shone in every part of the dance like moons." Now here is a very powerful illustration by John Leach showing Scrooge struggling to shut out the truth of his past. The ghost of Christmas past is the first of the 3 spirits after the visitation by Jacob Marley, his former business partner, to haunt Ebenezer Scrooge. This angelic and caring spirit shows Scrooge scenes from his past that occurred on or around Christmas in order to demonstrate to him the necessity of changing his ways, as well as to show the reader how Scrooge came to be a bitter, cold-hearted miser. According to Dickens' novel, the ghost of Christmas past appears to Scrooge as a white-robed androgynous figure of indeterminate age. It has on its head a blazing light reminiscent of a candle flame and carries a metal cap made in the shape of a candle extinguisher. The ghost is often portrayed as a woman in dramatic adaptations of the story, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. The Ghost of Christmas Present is another story. Leach had originally colored the plates in red until Dickens lightly admonished him to change it to green, as dictated by the text. Perhaps Leach had latched on to the idea, which has been stated, that his Ghost of Christmas Present is symbolic of Father Christmas and of all of the plenty and available to man in celebration of the day. When he first appears before Scrooge, He invites him to come in and know me better, man, and appears to Scrooge as a jolly giant with dark brown curls. He wears a fur-lined green robe, and on his head a holly wreath set with shining icicles. He carries a large torch made to resemble a cornucopia, and appears accompanied by a great feast. He states that he has had more than 1,800 brothers, and later reveals the ability to change his size to fit into any space. He also bears a scabbard with no sword in it, a representation of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. The Cratchit Family. As in his previous novels, real social concern motivated Dickens to write A Christmas Carol. In this instance, he was inspired to write a Christmas story highlighting the plight of the poor as an appeal for charity from those better off. Such charity was desperately needed during the severe economic depression of the 1840s. Having suffered considerable hardship and poverty during his upbringing, the passionate feelings evoked in Dickens' writings by social inequalities were based on bitter experience. Indeed, it is suggested that the Cratchit's house is modeled on the small four-room house at 16 Bayham Street in Camden Town, where Dickens lived at the age of 10. The 6 Cratchit children correspond to the Dickens children of that time, the character of Tiny Tim being echoed in Charles' youngest sickly brother, who was known as Tiny Fred. And here is Tiny Tim. There is no illustration in the first edition of A Christmas Carol of Tiny Tim. This depiction was actually created by Dickens' granddaughter. And when asked by Scrooge of the Ghost of Christmas Present what will happen to him, the ghost answers, "I see a vacant chair." Although he is but one of a relatively large cast of characters in Victorian England's most popular novella, Tiny Tim is certainly memorable, if not for his plucky cheerfulness in the face of adversity, then for his remarking, "God bless us, every one." Dickens' elder sister and oldest sibling, Fanny, was, like Fred's mother, a gifted musician and singer, and Fred was Scrooge's nephew in the book. Fan's son, Henry Burnett, has been proposed as the original of Tiny Tim, for Dickens had visited his sister and her sickly son in Manchester in October 1843 as the notion of A Christmas Carol matured. Another candidate for the original Timothy Cratchit is Dickens' younger brother Fred, since the manuscript, the original manuscript, contains that name for the sickly Cratchit son. Some have suggested that Tim may have suffered from kidney disease or polio, or possibly scurvy, a common illness for children deprived of proper nutrition, sunlight, and a healthy environment, and from which one could recover with a change of circumstances, one that Scrooge could amply supply. And this is a very powerful part of the book, when the Ghost of Christmas Present introduces ignorance and want. And when Scrooge says, "What's to be done with them?" he answers him with his own question. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And he says of ignorance and want, "Beware of them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy," which is ignorance. "For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." And this is a very powerful depiction by Leech, the last of the spirits, the phantom visit, the ominous portent of doom. And we're just going to see a little clip of the movie. So I'm just going to break away from the screen for a second.
This? I thought we had agreed that you would transport me home. Inspector, something informs me that the moment of our parting is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me, What man was that whom we saw lying dead? No, before I draw near to that stone, answer me this. Are the things you have shown me the shadows of the things that will be? Are they the shadows of the things that may be only? Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends. I accept them. But if those courses be departed from, the ends must change. Tell me that is so by what you show me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this visitation. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Good Spirit, your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Say that I may change these things by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Tell me that I may sponge away the writing of this stone. Spare me. Spare me.
Okay. So back to the presentation. I love that. I love George C. Scott does a great job with that. And here we have Scrooge having a Christmas bowl with Bob Cratchit. In his last illustration, Leach reinforces the notion expressed by Thomas Carlyle that mutual goodwill between man and master should replace the attitude that business is business and that the only bond between the capital and labor is monetary, the cash nexus. Thus, Leach's final image complements the highly nostalgic frontispiece, Mr. Fezziwigs Ball. So Fezziwigs Ball is the beginning of the book, and this is at the end of the book. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that truly be said of us and all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about the reception and legacy of A Christmas Carol. And here are a few quotes from the time. Christmas Carol is the most striking, the most picturesque, the most truthful of all the limnings which have proceeded from its author's pen. There is much mirth in the book, says a competent English critic, but more wisdom. Wisdom of that kind which men possess who have gazed thoughtfully but kindly on human life and have pierced deeper than their fellows into all the sunny nooks and dark recesses of the human breast. It is truly a reflection of life in miniature. And also Ainsworth magazine, it will be heard and remembered 100 Christmases to come, and that has been true. And finally, Thackeray, and they sometimes sparred. Who can listen to objections regarding such a book as this? It seems to me a national benefit, and to every man or woman who reads it, a personal kindness. Now, the book had a dedicated audience and had previously raised awareness of plights of less fortunate, but this small tome was a large gesture to remind Victorian society, especially the privileged, of their role as steward to fellow man. Many have attributed Dickens as being the creator of the modern festival of Christmas, But there were other influences as well, such as Victoria and Albert introducing the Christmas tree to English traditions in the 1840s, and others who encouraged the return to traditional celebrations. According to Christine Lalumia, A Christmas Carol and his other Christmas writings show Dickens' genuine delight in the joys of the season, but this was tempered by a concern for the welfare of the less fortunate, a subject that had colored debate about the health of society for several years. She continues that in the year 1843, the year A Christmas Carol was published, there was a piece in Punch which asked, "What have you done this Merry Christmas for the happiness of those about below you? Nothing? Do you dare with those sirloin cheeks and that port wine nose to answer nothing?" And again, as depicted in this etching that Leach did for the Illustrated London News, commended the poor who are kind to the poor. And this is called Fetching Home the Christmas Dinner of 1848. A Christmas Carol vividly reflected a prevailing mood and marked a change in perception from Christmas as a celebration of general festivities and conviviality toward one more specifically preoccupied with family and goodwill towards others. And Dickens himself, it meant a lot to Dickens, and in 1853, he began live performances in England and America, adapting the book into play form until shortly before he died. And these exhausting performances may have contributed to his early death of a stroke on June 9, 1870, at the age of 58. And the British Museum, you can go online and you can see they have a depiction here they actually have a copy of it, so you can see what he used for his readings. It's great that there's just so many archival pieces online today. It's just wonderful. I also wanted to look at A Christmas Carol today. Now, many versions and inspired works, and we have some of them here, and of course, many of them you can get through the library. There are many local performances of A Christmas Carol. Now, there's one with a storyteller, Jonathan Crook, who I saw in person. He's amazing. And it's in Tarrytown usually, but this year it's online. So you can purchase tickets online, and it's on December 20th. So you might want to check that out. I also highly recommend the movie The Man Who Invented Christmas with Dan Stevens and Christopher Plummer as Scrooge, which came out a few years back and is based on the book of the same name. And the Morgan Museum has a special exhibit every year of A Christmas Carol. And so you can go online and you can see it. You can go in person. It shows here that from December 7th through January 11th, you can see it. But it's amazing because you can look at the manuscript and you can look at his notes, and it's really very fascinating. So I hope you will take a look at that as well. If you've never been to the Morgan, it is one of my favorite museums. It's a little boutique museum. It has a place. I've even just gone there and had a cup of tea. It's just a lovely space and very, very enjoyable. And hopefully we can all get back to visiting all these places quite soon. On hearing of Dickens' death in June 1870, former illustrator William Buss was moved to attempt a large watercolor, Dickens' Dream, which portrayed the dozing author seated in his Gad's Hill Place study, surrounded by many of the characters he had created. The desk, chair, and background of the painting were closely based on the empty chair, an engraving made at Gad's Hill in 1870, shortly after Dickens' death, by Samuel Luke Fildes. The painting was Buss's last attempt to illustrate Dickens' characters, and he modestly reproduced the images of the artists who had succeeded him. However, before he could finish it, Buss died at his home on February 26, 1875. Today, the painting is exhibited at the Charles Dickens Museum in London. In closing, as Claire Tomalin states in her book, Charles Dickens, A Life, A Christmas Carol went straight to the heart of the public and has remained lodged there ever since, with its mixture of horror, despair, hope, and warmth. Its message, a Christian message that even the worst of sinners may repent and become a good man. And its insistence that good cheer, food and drink, shared gifts, and even dancing are not mere frivolous pleasures, but basic expressions of love and mutual support among all human beings. I hope that you will continue to explore the original work and commentary surrounding A Christmas Carol. And as Tiny Tim said, may God bless us, everyone, during this beautiful season. And if any of you would like me to, I could maybe give the bibliography to Heidi and she can share it with you. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can. Does anybody have any questions?
No, you should be applauded, Elaine.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ava.
Wonderful.
I just want to say it was very good. I really enjoyed it.
Great
That's lovely.
presentation, Elaine. Good job.
I'm so glad. And I hope that it inspires if you haven't read it or maybe want to do a reread now that you've learned some of these facts.
Yes, I need to do a reread. And I will
And
watch.
somebody asked where the museum is.
Mhm.
Okay. So the museum is down on the east side. I think it's 37th Street and Park. So look up the Morgan Museum, and it's one of my favorite places.
37th and Madison.
39th and Madison.
39th and Madison. Thank you. I
39th and
know that
Madison.
I cut through, I come out of Grand Central and I just cut up and I wasn't sure if it was Madison or Park. So
39th and Madison.
thank you.
Elaine,
Yes.
I just want to say, I love the presentation, very interesting. I read a lot of stuff about him that wasn't very flattering. Did you happen to come across any of that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely. Actually, there's a new book out that just came out recently, and I was just I forgot what the title was. My husband and I were talking about it. My husband was like, oh my gosh, he was just terrible. And you know, a lot of what he wrote when he was young. And then he really was very hypocritical, you know, as so many people can be, as he got older, and was especially with his family and with his wife.
Yeah,
So-
the book, I think the book is called The Mystery of Charles Dickens, because his last book was The Mystery of Edward Drood.
Okay, thanks.
Oh,
Yeah,
Thank
so,
you.
and it's very unflattering, especially the way he treated his wife and his family
Yes.
when he had, I guess, his, whatever, the actress that he had taken up
yeah.
with at the end of
When
his
he
life.
had a girlfriend, he kicked his wife out of their home.
Yes.
He
Yes.
banished her from his home, treated her terribly, and like you said, hypocritical. He's writing these great stories about the human condition,
Yep.
and he's not very nice. He called himself the one and only. If that gives you a better idea of how he thought about himself.
Yes, he, as I say, as he was more idealistic when he was younger, and a lot of the earlier biographies didn't get into as much detail about that, where today there's a lot of exposure.
Yeah.
So it's definitely.
Isn't it
as-
interesting
yeah.
though that he?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and it's. I mean, Claire Tomalin, she takes him to task pretty much here, and again, a lot of the more recent books you'll read it, you will definitely hear more about that, and it's very sad, and even with his own children, with his relationship with his children, so it's kind of like you see him in the earlier years, and then in the later years, he really, he did fail somewhat, greatly. But I like to look, it's like anything. This kernel of gold came out of a time and even was forged through his own hardships. And don't you find that even sometimes you think, my gosh, who went through so much hurt, and then they write about, and they wind up inflicting a hurt on someone else. It's I guess
Yes.
the human beings just can do that. But his work, what I love about his work is that I see myself in a lot of his stories. I think that he writes about humanity very succinctly, and
Yeah.
human feelings, and how you would feel as a young child, especially when you read David Copperfield, which is probably my favorite.
It was his favorite too, I think.
Yes. And when you read that and you think of what a child had to go through and the kind of the plight that he was put in, although, it's fiction, it touches you because you think, how would I feel? Or there are times that you've been hurt in a similar way over something else, and you can understand that. So he's a masterful writer, but he certainly was not a saint in any way.
But like
What
you
was
said, he
most-
brought awareness to the human condition, to what was
Ex-
going on, and that's a good thing.
Yes, exactly. Especially with A Christmas Carol. Ava, you had a question?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just want to make a remark that maybe he was a person who didn't do what he preached, but the theme of the book is universal. And unfortunately, no matter when in history, no matter what country or what kind of society or political situation, it's been always there, the word of the haves, who have and who
Yes.
don't have. And that's why it resonates for 200 years, because this doesn't change, and it may never change.
It's true. And he didn't have to. He was wealthy enough. He was famous enough. That's what I think he was trying to say. He worked with Miss Coots, who they started a program for fallen women. These women were ostracized in society, and they tried to get them, work so they could sustain themselves. Kind of like, I guess, like a reform type of work. But he worked a lot with her. She was also instrumental in showing him the ragged schools with these poor children, which inspired him writing a Christmas Carol, was one of the inspirations. And when you think he wrote it in 6 weeks, it's like a symphony. He does it in the form of staves. Instead of the chapters, he has it as stave 1, stave 2. So it really is, it's like a seamless inspiration. And I think someone just said about it being genius. Maybe it was Mary Beth. Sometimes the genius comes out of the pain. Yes. But he was a genius. I'm not sure about he tried to have his wife committed to an asylum. That might be true. Again, a lot more has been coming out. And that's why I was saying, even though I've been a lifelong Dickens fan, I have to keep reading about it because there's just so much about him to know.
What was his most financially successful book?
You know what? I would have to check on that, Ginger. I'll get back to you about that. I'm not sure off the bat. But I know that this was a big success, and he needed the money because, again, sadly, his father did not discontinue his spending. He was a spendthrift, and he would hit up Charles, and the man who invented Christmas, Christopher Plummer. It's really a great movie. And again, it's not. There is some
Poetic license.
Yes, they do take poetic license with it. But Dan Stevens is wonderful as Dickens, who was in Downton Abbey. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that, and we do, I'm almost positive we have it at the library. We can get it for you, and we do have the George C. Scott, A Christmas Carol, and all the other ones. Ava, you had another question?
Yes. How much do we know about his education? Whether I'm sure he didn't have much of a chance, but how much education did he have? How many years? And how did it how did he learn writing? Was there any circumstance?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So Charles Dickens, he had to leave school early because they went to debtor's prison. So Fanny was able to continue on a scholarship. He had to go to work at 12. And when he came out, he had a little more education. But he was wounded because his mother, they kind of liked that he became the breadwinner. And they really they begrudged him going back and getting more education. And he resented that. But what he did is he became a journalist.
Oh.
And so he became a journalist, and he also invented his own shorthand.
Oh.
So some of his notes are written in his own shorthand, which may have been why he was able to write so quickly. Yeah. So he, being out on the beat and writing, and I think he did some clerking, but that was a very inspiring and instrumental experience for him.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions?
I think it came up, A Tale of Two Cities has sold 200 million copies.
Okay. That's the most, thank you, Swadish. I should have asked, we have librarians here. There's 4 of us here. That's right. So it's A Tale of Two Cities?
Yeah, that's what it says in the
Okay. Amazing. You know what? Even though I say David Copperfield is my favorite, that every time I think of another one, I'm like, oh, Nicholas Nickleby. Now, my husband and I, during this, COVID, even though we're not locked down anymore, we're all binge watching everything. So he said, oh, you know what? I got Nicholas Nickleby from PBS when it was on Broadway with Roger Rees. He said, I got it on Netflix or whatever, Amazon. So we watched the whole thing. Have any of you seen that with Roger Rees? It was like 10 hours a day or something. It was like a amazing production that was done back in the early 80s. And that's also a very moving story. So, Great Expectations, Bleak House, they're all great. And this is a great time of year to tuck into Dickens. It really is. It's nice and cozy, get your cup of tea and, really, really maybe explore him and the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is his work, and then you may want to look into some biographies about him. But there's a lot that we're still doing today because of the inspiration of Charles Dickens. 200.
Elaine, I
Yes.
just wanted to say, you were saying about reading other books. There's a book, it's historical fiction. It's not nonfiction, but historical fiction. It's called A Girl in a Blue Dress.
Okay.
And the author is Arnold, is the last name. And I read it maybe 5 years ago, and it's a very interesting story. The girl in the blue dress is his wife. So it's the story of Dickens and his wife and how, from her point of view, but it's historical fiction. So it's not factual 100%, but it's based on how you learn about how he was and how he treated his family and his ego and all about that. It was very interesting. It was entertaining.
I love historical fiction. There's a lot of fact in there. Of course they do.
Yes.
Look at Victoria.
There's research, but
it's the historical fiction is fascinating, but you're getting the facts and you're getting some of the history in there as well. So there's another one that was.
It was very good.
Yeah, there was another one that was written. I read it and I can't think of the title now. The historical fiction about Dickens. I can't think of it right now, but there's so much. There is so much out there, and it's more to explore. But at this time of year, we've got A Christmas Carol. He also wrote a couple of books. He did Christmas stories. So he did have a collection of some other Christmas stories as well, because a lot of his material was serialized. I don't know if you remember me saying at the beginning of the program that this was a standalone tome. Most of Dickens' work was serialized, and so it would come out in installments, and people would wait for the next installment. Actually, in America, They were waiting for little Dorrit to find out if she lived or died. They were at the docks because they wanted the next installment over from England, what Dickens wrote. He had a very big fan base here. So I hope that you'll
That's why
explore
his stuff was so wordy too, because he was paid by the word.
Yes, yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Were the names like Ebenezer,
Installments, yeah.
Scrooge, were those common names at that time?
You know, I'm not sure. I mean, in the movie, The Man Who Invented Christmas, it shows Dan Stevens trying to think of, and they said, I mean, Dickens was an actor. He had acting. He and Wilkie Collins were in like an acting company at the later part of his life. And so he was very theatrical. He would act out the people. And so Dan Stevens shows him, again, this is fiction, so I'm not sure, you know, what they got this from, but him going Scrooge, you know, squeezing, and him trying to find these names. And if you think of the names in Dickens books, he always has, you know, these like, you know, in Nicholas Nickleby, Wackford Squeers, you know, school for boys, you know, Wackford. He was a mean school teacher, you know. So he always has, you know, has these names that kind of denote what the person is.
Okay. And how Scrooge became, you know, what that word means to us today.
Yes, he was a real Scrooge. That's right.
Deep.
Right. Absolutely. Any more questions?
And then there's a question say that, have you read Mr. Dickinson's and his Christmas Carol?
Oh, no, I have not. Have you read it, Sue? Is it good?
Sue.
On our list.
On her list.
Yeah, I'll have to add that to my list. That sounds great. Well, I thank you for letting me share my love of A Christmas Carol and of Dickens, his works. And I hope that you will enjoy some of them as well. And please reach out to me. You can email me at the library. I didn't put my email up here, but I could send it. What I'll do is I will send it tomorrow with Katie. We'll send the bibliography if any of you want to see any of the books that I looked at for research. And please reach out to me and tell me what you're doing and share that with me as well. Jane, did you have a question? Did I see a question here?
No.
Oh, I think I did. I got you with the asylum.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good.
Ah,
The Woman in White. That's the Wilkie
Hello.
Collins. Yeah.
Wayne, one thing I'm doing is I'm going back and reading each night books like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, and all the books that I've saved from my kids and from when I was small.
Oh.
And that's a fun thing to do.
That is great. I think that this is a great time for us to renew and review and go back, and you know, it's a touchstone. I mean, tonight we had a children's art program, and he was drawing ice forts with you know, how you'd make a snow fort with the ice, and I was like, oh my gosh, like you're bringing me right back. He was saying we'd make the ice fort, we'd pour water over it, and it would freeze. It'd be like 5 feet high, and I'm sure many of you can remember doing that. We'd have those very wintry, snowy winters, and we would do that. So it's so nice to revisit those times and those scenes. And you know, there's so many bad things we read about every day, but there's lots of good things and lots of warm things to think about as well.
My philosophy is you've got to do what gives you joy every day.
You're right. You're right. Well, it's all we have, one day at a time, right? We've got to live it to the fullest. That's for sure. Well, I really wish you a wonderful holiday, and I'm so glad that you could join me.